Hello and welcome to the People's Podcast. I'm your host, Yogendran, and today on our show we have Akshaya Shekaran. Akshaya has volunteered extensively with refugees, both through UNICEF and through STAR, which is Student Action for Refugees. She's also done a lot of research in the difference between refugees and an asylum seeker, and is going to help us answer today's big question of what actually is an asylum seeker. So Akshaya, it's really lovely to have you on.
Thank you, lovely to be here.
So I suppose to start from the top, what is the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker?
Great question. So a refugee is a person who has fled their country of origin due to a well-founded fear of persecution. So according to the UN, this could be because of race, a religion, belonging to a particular social group. And legally speaking, a refugee is someone who has fled their country, applied for asylum, gained asylum, and is now protected legally by being a refugee. Whereas an asylum seeker is someone who has fled their country of origin, applied for asylum, and is still waiting to find out whether they have the legal protection of being a refugee.
So how do you go about requesting asylum? Do you have to... Is there, I imagine there's a lot of forms to fill out.
Yeah, there's a lot of forms to fill out. It's quite a complicated and bureaucratic process. So in theory, anyone who is seeking protection is eligible to apply for asylum. So as soon as you arrive in the country of choice, you could apply for asylum. And following this, there should be a screening interview. You get placed in accommodation, and then there will be an asylum interview where you can be accepted or rejected. But in reality, it's much more complicated than that. In the UK, you can be detained in the process of this. So, such as Yarl's Wood, where the human rights abuses are extortionate, and also people can wait indefinitely to hear back from their asylum claim. And during this time, they're not allowed to work. So they have to survive off $37.75 every week, which doesn't continue on to the next week. So you just get given a debit card, which gives you $37.75 every week. So if you're a family and you want to buy a winter coat, you could choose between having that winter coat or buying food for your family for the week.
So it's interesting you mentioned that in order to claim asylum, you have to be in that country. So, but more recently, the Interior Minister of Germany, on the 30th of October, argued that applicants should undergo initial assessment for asylum at the borders rather than the country itself. He argued that the Dublin regulations in which you have to be in the country are no longer helpful for Europe and no longer working. I know I've just thrown this article on you, but what are your initial sort of opinions on that?
That's really interesting. I think it highlights how European policy is creating a hostile environment. The Dublin regulation was initiated to ensure that children and families have safe protection from fleeing their countries of origin.
I mean, wow. So you mentioned what the application process is like. But for those people who don't get asylum, what happens to them?
So if you are rejected from your asylum claim, you can appeal, which is especially if you have new evidence, this can be taken into light. Although sometimes this can also be done in good faith. Following this, if you get accepted, you might get indefinite leave to remain. But more likely, if you're rejected, then you could be told to do a voluntary return, which often within this time, people become destitute, they become homeless. Or a forced return where people are essentially shackled to their seats on the plane and forced to go back to their country of origin. For a lot of people, I think it's important to mention in the UK, most people are rejected from their asylum claim. In 2017, 68% of all asylum claims were rejected.
Wow. So how long can these processes take then? So you mentioned people are often held up in detention centres. How long can people expect to be held there for?
Terrifyingly, people can be held indefinitely. There is no limit to the amount of time people can be held in a detention centre, or people can wait for their asylum claim. I've spoken to people who have been waiting years and years for their asylum claim, during which time they're not allowed to work, so it exacerbates the poverty within which they're already in.
So you've had a lot of experience volunteering, and so I suppose you've seen it on a first-hand basis, the impact of these EU policies and the crisis more generally. So can you just tell us a bit about those experiences? What was it like to volunteer in a refugee camp and with refugees more generally?
Yeah, of course. So I've had a plethora of different volunteering experiences. It began when I started to volunteer in a community centre in Swansea, which is where I'm from. And this was called Unity in Diversity. So this was more of an integrative volunteering approach where we provided food and friendship and resources for refugees and asylum seekers. Whereas following this, when I volunteered in Calais for a month, that was on the front lines of the refugee crisis, quote unquote. So this was with the Refugee Community Kitchen. They are one of the charities which operates within the Help Refugees warehouse in Calais. So this is a group of, I think it's about 8 different charities which volunteer with on-the-ground distribution.
Okay.
And in Refugee Community Kitchen, you provide food. So you like chop the vegetables, wash the dishes, and then distribute the food to, I think 2,000 people, 2,000 meals are distributed every day to refugees and asylum seekers living in Calais and Dunkirk. And then for Croatia, I went with UNICEF on campus and we were volunteering with Are You Serious? And this is a Croatian specific organization. So we would organize their free shop in the day. And a free shop, if for anyone who doesn't know, it's essentially a shop, quote unquote, where refugees and asylum seekers can choose what they want rather than being given donations, so it like retains some humility. Oh, and also for Student Action for Refugees, it's just conversation club, so teaching English quite informally to improve confidence skills.
And is that locally in the local area?
Yeah, it's in Coventry, anyone can get involved.
So what was it like then working there? What were the sort of take-home ideas, take-home stories that really moved you?
There are so many. I think, so in Calais, it's a weird paradoxical world because on the one hand, in the day, you're in this incredible kitchen with these welcoming people, you're chopping veg, doing all the dishes. Even though it's hard work, it's a really welcoming environment to be in. And then you go to distribute the food and you see the situation that people are living in, and it's unbelievable. Like they're living in flimsy tents which have cuts all over them because the CRS, the French riot police, conduct evictions 3 times a week because they feel that the response to the refugee crisis is to make sure that people don't feel welcome there. So they slash their tents, they take their belongings. And the stories that I heard some of them were quite jarring. One person told me that the CRS once took one of their shoes, just like one of each pair of their shoes, just to humiliate them, which is so inhumane. And people have bruises all over them just because of police brutality. I think that in Croatia, that was a different kind of jarring because I was working more with children. So when you hear stories from a child's perspective, it's
very, very different.
So the children there were also covered in bruises. Some of them were from conflict at home, but a lot of them were also from police brutality.
Wow.
And some of the stories were just insane. There was one Sudanese boy who was telling us how his friend was lost in the mountains and he called the air ambulance, and the air ambulance didn't go look for his friend because they knew that his friend was an asylum seeker, so they just let him die in the cold, which is horrible. One child was telling me that before she was in Croatia, she was in Bosnia, and that was 100 people sharing one toilet. And also the police would come and they would bang on the doors and they would do searches. But one time they were banging on the doors and they asked them to leave. And then they were telling her, like, you're a dog, you're all dogs. And she was crying, but they didn't care, which is horrible. And one boy who was about 3 years old, he was so sweet, but he had these black teeth because they couldn't afford milk. So, but then at the same time, I should point out, like, they were the most hopeful strong, amazing people. There was one boy in particular who inspired us so much because he had the dream of being a nurse. He was there for all his family. He told jokes and everything. I just feel like these people are amazing and they need to be welcomed into the UK.
I think it's really interesting. I'm a bit lost for words, if I'm honest, after those stories. I suppose you sort of lose track of what the human cost of these crises are. Like I said, the German Interior Minister looks at it from a very macro perspective. I think so does a lot of news as well.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, really moving, I think, to hear those stories from someone who's heard them firsthand. I suppose, how did you feel then when you had to leave? Was that difficult after leaving each experience, as it were?
Yeah, it was, to be honest, it was really, really difficult. On the one hand, because you're leaving this bubble of volunteering, but also the guilt and the sadness for not being there helping anymore.
Because you're going back and leaving everyone in that situation. Yeah.
For sure, yeah. So for example, I went to Calais in, I think, 2017. No, 2018. And then 2019, this summer, I went back just for a week.
Yeah.
And I saw some of the same refugees and asylum seekers who had been there for a year. And that made me feel obviously really guilty and terrible because I had been having this great year at university enjoying myself and they had still been in Calais.
Same place.
But at the same time, something that if anyone has the same experiences, I would say that the antidote to hopelessness is action. So just keeping on trying to get involved with helping is the best way to deal with feelings like guilt and overwhelmment about this.
So in your experience, what is it that refugees need the most? What is it that they're looking for?
I think every refugee wants to be seen not as a refugee, but as a human being. So politically, legally, economically speaking, they need a safe passage from their home countries to the country that they want to go to, instead of having to walk across countries, having to travel across on a boat, which isn't safe for that many people. They need a safe, legal journey that protects them. And also when they arrive in their country of origin, I think they should be treated as human beings and not detained as if they were criminals, because all they're doing is trying to find a safe place to call home.
And so, if people listening are interested in getting involved, how is the best way of doing that?
You should obviously get involved with the People's Backpack, but also start Student Action for Refugees. If you're on campus, I think that's probably the best way to get involved. We do conversation clubs, so we volunteer Monday, Wednesday and Friday teaching English informally to refugees and asylum seekers. It's really fulfilling and a meaningful process because you go in, you see people who can't speak much English, and then a year later, they're like applying for businesses and jobs and things. So yeah, that's amazing. Also, you don't need to come 3 times a week. You can come whenever you want.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for telling us about your experiences. It's been really interesting to hear that sort of first-hand account, I suppose, of what it's actually like in those refugee camps. And like Akshaya said, if you do want to get involved, there'll be more information on our Instagram, on our Facebook page. Just follow @The People's Backpack. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much.